Tonight on Bridge City News, a 70-year-old cyclist is riding across the country raising money and awareness for Parkinson's disease. We caught up with him in Lethbridge today. Major financial help is being offered for canola farmers being negatively affected by the Canadian canola ban in China. And the Canadian military is working overtime trying to save homes in flood-ravaged Ottawa.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, accompanied by Energy Minister Sonia Savage, announced today that he has proclaimed into law a bill allowing it to cut oil to BC. It's a retaliation for obstruction of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project. Kenney says they won't begin cutting oil immediately, but wants to send a strong message they will defend Alberta's interests.
We did this to have the power to protect Alberta, to protect our ability to get full value for our resources should circumstances require. The campaign to landlock Alberta's resources, resulting in the failure of several pipeline projects to Canada's west and east coasts, has been economically devastating. The law that we proclaimed yesterday in our cabinet gives Alberta the ability to, if and only for as long as needed, to control the export of our natural resources in order to maximize their value, whether through BC or elsewhere.
BC Premier John Horgan announced today that his government will be suing Alberta over the legislation that would permit cutting off oil and gas shipments to his province. The federal government is changing a payment program for canola farmers to help those affected by China's ban on Canadian canola. The maximum loan limit through the program will be boosted, as will the interest-free portion.
Canada's farmers should know that we have their backs. While we always push for further high-level technical discussions with China, our government continues to listen and act to make sure farmers have the support they need. That is why today we are announcing that we are making changes to the Advanced Payments Program that supports farmers. For 2019, we are increasing the maximum loan limit for all farmers from $400,000 to $1 million. For canola farmers, we are also increasing the interest-free portion from $100,000 to $500,000.
One of our regular contributors, Brian Lilly, says Ottawa should have taken a much stronger leadership role when it came to the ban on Canadian canola earlier on.
Our government has been weak on all of these fronts. They have not pushed back hard enough. They have not called in our allies. And some of our allies, because this particular government has frustrated them, aren't willing to stand up. And so our canola producers are looking at huge problems. This is on top of the problems that we've got with durum wheat producers trying to sell into Italy, where they've been selling some of the top quality wheat to go into pasta for years. The pulse crops going into places like India that are facing huge tariffs. There are many problems for agriculture, and I'm not sure that this Prime Minister gets it.
Catch the full interview with the always colorful Brian Lilly coming up after Business News. From Tofino, British Columbia to St. John's, Newfoundland, Walter Reich and his wife are traveling across the country to raise money and awareness for Parkinson's disease. Ainsley O'Reilly explains Walter's journey as he cycles through southern Alberta.
Walter Reich plans on cycling 100 kilometers a day from Vancouver Island to the Maritimes in an effort to raise money for Parkinson's disease. So far, he's been successful, but southern Alberta winds have presented their challenges.
Normally you have backwind, except not yesterday, the day before I had from Sparwood to Pincher Creek, I had headwind all the way, and that was tough. Even the terrain wasn't that bad, but the wind was really brutal.
The wind and the cold has not impressed us. Since we are on the road, we have frozen more than we have sweat.
Walter and his wife Regula owned a hotel and restaurant in Magnetawan, Ontario, but sold it to finally pursue a Canadian adventure and raise $50,000 for Parkinson's disease.
Everybody is doing something else, and for Parkinson's, not many people doing some fundraiser, so that's why I choose Parkinson.
What I admire is the way he pedals. It's just amazing. He goes so fast and he's so confident, and He can rest well, which is important. I try to feed him and make sure he drinks enough.
He's currently raised $1,000, and if you want to donate, you can visit Walter and Giant's GoFundMe page. For Bridge City News, I'm Ainsley O'Reilly.
With your smartphone, you can explore some of the most beautiful places on the planet and daydream of your next vacation. While it's just a fantasy for many people, one couple from Lethbridge has actually taken the plunge and done just that, making traveling their life. BCN's Loris Alexander explains how this couple caught the travel bug.
Chelsea and Curtis Hawkins are travel vloggers, and their favorite destination? Well, their hometown Lethbridge.
The people in Lethbridge is a great asset for sure. I think that you're right. It's still pretty big, but it still has a lot of small town feels to it. So,
the Hawkins really want to show off Lethbridge within and outside the community. That's their end goal. And they've partnered with Tourism Lethbridge for that.
With Tourism Lethbridge, I think that there are lots of great businesses and organizations in the community that work really, really hard to make sure that you don't ever say that there's nothing to do here. So our hope and our intent is to help promote lots of those events and show people from outside of Lethbridge what's going on in our community, but also show people within our community what's going on. So for Tourism Lethbridge, that's our big goal and our plans anyhow.
Becoming travel vloggers was an easy choice for the Hawkins. Their passion for videography, adventure, and travel combined made them ideal candidates.
We love making videos, we love going new places, and like we had said before, we like finding adventure in everything we do. So whether it's a weekend trip to Montana or whether it's going to Southeast Asia again, for ourselves, we like filming it and having these memories to go back on. So we're just happy to be able to share the experiences that we have. So,
when asked about their favorite characteristic of Lethbridge,
probably the location of Lethbridge. Like it's kind of like the hub to a lot of really great things around here. Even though it's not in Lethbridge, like you're an hour away from Waterton, 2-3 hours away from Banff.
The Hawkins say you don't have to live in a big city to have a great online presence or create content. Lethbridge is just fine. For Bridge City News, I'm Loris Alexander.
Grade 5 and 6 students from St. Teresa of Calcutta School in Lethbridge had the opportunity to hold the University of Lethbridge Convocation ceremonial brass mace. The U of L's Chief Marshal spoke to students about the history of the mace, the convocation, and what they can expect if they graduate from the U of L.
The mace is a symbol of authority to the University Board of Governors and the Senate to award degrees. And the mace is made up of different parts. They were listening and they were eager to learn because that's the joy of academics. They listened, they were able to follow through in the presentation, and they asked good questions about the mace. And this is just to encourage them to look forward to this opportunity of becoming a university graduate one day, and even to become a chief marshal one day.
The brass mace has been used at the University of Lethbridge convocation ceremonies since 1988. Wish Tree author Catherine Applegate made a special appearance at Lethbridge Collegiate Institute today.
Today was just absolutely breathtaking. I literally cried 3 times. And I found myself thinking, isn't it beautiful that a book, when read by a ton of people, can bring you together in such a meaningful way.
The taxi driver who drove Mary Van Aken, Catherine's publicist, to her hotel last night was talking about the book because his 3 children were involved in the project. It's everywhere, and it's something that creates conversation and gives everyone an opportunity to learn and grow from this experience.
Students and staff from School District 51's 20-plus institutions have read Wish Tree as part of the One District One book project. We now know the location of the site for the new fire hall for West Lethbridge. It'll be located at the corner of 277 Rocky Mountain Boulevard and 300 Métis Trail West. Council approved the rezoning of the 2 plots of the land in Watermark Development. Construction is slated to begin in 2020. Now, some of the concerns raised by Mayor Chris Spearman is that the new fire hall will be located just a kilometer from the current one. Fire Chief Rich Hildebrand said once the area is fully developed, it'll be more of a central location and firefighters will be able to move quicker through the west side. A special candlelit vigil for the victims of Easter Sunday's terrorist attacks in Sri Lanka will be held this Saturday at the Miss City Church in Lethbridge. Everyone is invited to attend the memorial remembering the victims and to pray for peace. The ceremony takes place 7 p.m. on Saturday night. The Miss City Church is located at 502 13th Street North. A mobile mammography trailer is on the way to Milk River so residents can be screened for breast cancer. Alberta Health Services says it will be stationed at the Prairie Rose Lodge on 3rd Avenue Northwest on May 6th and 7th. Residents can book an appointment by calling 1-800-667-0604. The mobile mammography trailer allows rural communities across Alberta access to a screen test where it's not readily available. The Government of Canada says breast cancer accounts for about 26% of new cases of cancer and 13% of all cancer deaths in Canadian women. 1 in 8 women are expected to develop breast cancer during their lifetime. 2 Lethbridge men have been charged following a break, enter, and theft at the Lethbridge Electrical Substation. The damage was estimated at around $300,000. Police say on April 28th, the suspects cut the lock on the gate, then damaged a lot of the equipment. The perps then stole a laser level, network connector, battery charge pack, and spools of copper. The $250,000 transformer was badly damaged. The 2 suspects were picked up a day later at a home on 7th Avenue North. 57-year-old Daniel Priest and 29-year-old Travis Priest face charges of shop breaking and theft. David Priest appeared in court today, and Travis Priest will go before a judge on May the 7th. RCMP and Fort Macleod are looking for a couple of suspects who damaged the surveillance system and the equipment which holds money at a car wash. Police say the smash and grab took place Thursday, April 18th at the BCD car wash on 13th Street in Fort Macleod. The suspects can be seen arriving in an old model Honda car prior to the system being damaged. If you have any information that can help the RCMP, call Crime Stoppers right away at 1-800-222-8477. You can also submit information online at tipsubmit.com. The Canadian Armed Forces demonstrated their flood relief operations in Constance Bay and Ottawa. More than 700 military members have been helping locals by filling sandbags, constructing walls, and assisting responding agencies on the ground as flooding continues to ravage our nation's capital. In total, more than 5,500 people have been helping with sandbagging efforts in the regions most affected. Around 1,600 people have joined the city's Spring Flood 2019 Facebook page. Flooding has not only been a problem in Ontario and Quebec, but Iowa crews had to evacuate people from buildings as a flood barrier collapsed along the Mississippi River.
It's unbelievable. I know I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this before. I don't want to say that it's shocking, but it's probably what you come to expect when you live near a river. There's always a chance that things like this can happen. But it's to see it in person happen so close to home is eye-opening.
Just as we had a day of mourning in Lethbridge, remembering those who lost their lives on the job, thousands of workers and activists took to the streets around the world demanding better working conditions in May Day rallies. There were many arrests and clashes in some cities including Paris, France, Istanbul, Turkey, and St. Petersburg, Russia. An activist group says more than 100 people have been arrested in rallies across Russia. There were also reports of injuries at many of the rallies. Venezuelan opposition's envoy to the United States says the current uprising occurring on the streets of Venezuela is not a coup, but rather a push toward restoring democracy.
Today, the interim president, Juan Guaidó, has announced the beginning of the Operación Libertad, freedom operation. He has called the military institution to support the Venezuelan people on the streets and to restore our democracy in our country, and also to support the full implementation of the Constitution approved by the people in 1999. This is only the beginning. This is an operation which is developing right now. We will see more events in the hours and the days to come. I want to be very clear with the international community. This is not a military coup. This is a constitutional process led by the Venezuelan people under the leadership of a civilian, the interim president of Venezuela, Juan Guaidó. He's calling for the restoration of our constitution and, of course, for the restoration of our democratic system.
We had a mainly overcast day today as the low pressure system has settled in. Some rain is in the forecast tonight. Complete weather details are coming up. We had lots of clouds again today. Tonight, a chance of showers developing with a low near 2 degrees. Tomorrow, a chance of rain developing and a high near 10. The clouds should clear out on Friday, bringing lots of sunshine and a high near 18. Saturday, a mixture of sun and cloud and a high near 9. The clouds and showers return on Sunday with a high of 17. Monday, the mercury will drop down to 7 with more rain. Showers and a chance of flurries on Tuesday and a high near 9. Looking at the almanac, the average high for this time of year is 16 and an average low of 2. The highest temperature on this date was recorded in 1941 at 26 degrees, and the record low was minus 12 in 1954. Sunrise was at 6:09, sunset at 8:48. Looking at the national forecast for tomorrow now, Victoria will have a mixture of sun and cloud and a high near 10. Mainly cloudy in Vancouver and high expected near 16. A chance of showers and 8 is on tap for Calgary on Thursday. Clouds mixed with sun and 7 for Edmonton. A slight chance of a thunder shower and a high near 14 for Regina tomorrow. Rain and 11 for Saskatoon. Winnipeg will be mostly rainy and a high near 12. In the central part of the country, Toronto will have rain and 13. Ottawa, which is dealing with so much flooding, will also have more showers and 13 degrees. Montreal will be overcast to 9. In the Maritimes, Fredericton, New Brunswick will be mainly sunny and 13. Clearing and 11 in Halifax. Charlottetown, PEI will have lots of sunshine and 5. And in St. John's, Newfoundland, there's a chance of flurries and a high near 3 degrees for tomorrow. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney says his new government now has the power to reduce oil flows to British Columbia in the fight over the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. Kenney says he called BC Premier John Horgan and proclaimed the bill into law yesterday. He told Horgan that it is not Alberta's intention to use the legislation right away, but Alberta will defend its interests. BC Premier John Horgan says he remains convinced that the Trans Mountain Pipeline project is not in the best interests of British Columbians. He says he will continue to defend the environment and the tens of thousands of jobs that depend on it. Farm Credit Canada says the average value of Canadian farmland rose nearly 7% last year. The agricultural lender said, however, that the growth rate may be cut in half this year amid the ongoing canola trade issues with China. Values have increased every year since 1993, but recent rises are lower than those from 2011 to 2015. In March, China suspended the licenses of 2 major exporters of canola seed, citing concerns about pests. Chinese companies have stopped purchasing the product from Canadian producers. A British judge has sentenced WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to 50 weeks in prison for jumping bail in 2012. This was the reaction from earlier today.
As editor of WikiLeaks, that this sentencing here today is an outrage and it's vindictive in nature, and it doesn't give us a lot of faith in the UK justice system for the fight ahead. To get a sentence only 2 weeks short of the maximum sentence is an outrage. It's almost double the sentencing guideline. But the fight continues. Tomorrow is the big fight, the start of the big and most important fight, to fight against the extradition of Julian Assange to the United States. What is at stake there could be a question of life and death for Mr. Assange.
The 47-year-old Assange took refuge in London in 2012 to avoid extradition to Sweden over sexual assault allegations. Now, here's a look at today's markets. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, help is on the way for canola farmers. And a canola ban affecting our farmers, Ottawa announced today that the maximum loan limit for farmers will be boosted from $400,000 to $1 million. The interest-free portion will also rise from $100,000 to $500,000. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has had kind of a rough week, from being blasted on sandbagging in Ottawa to referring to Japan as China. He was also mocked in a recent episode of The Simpsons. One of our regular contributors, Brian Lilly, has details next. But first, here's a look what's happening in and around your community.
Here's your Bridge City News community calendar. Come for a theatrical experience to Jake's Gift, a moving story of a World War II veteran's reluctant return to Juno Beach on Saturday, May 4th at the Lethbridge Legion. This multi-award-winning play features the performance by its playwright, Julia Mackey. Tickets are $20 per person and are available at the Lethbridge Legion office. Doors open at 2 p.m. with the show beginning at 3. To learn more about this play, visit jakesgift.com. Join your neighbors and take part in Lethbridge's Spring Reuse Rendezvous, taking place this Saturday, May 4th from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. This gives residents the opportunity to give away or collect usable items for free. Place your items suitable to reuse in front of your residence Friday evening. Ensure that they're marked free. Then Saturday morning, people are invited to cruise the streets and help themselves to these free items. The annual Coulee Cleanup, organized by the Helen Schuler Nature Center, will continue until May 31st. This is a great opportunity for individuals, families, sports teams, and community groups to help protect our fragile environment. Register by calling 403-320-3064 or email hsnc@lethbridge.ca. And that's your Bridge City News community calendar.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was blasted recently while sandbagging in a flood zone in Ottawa. Conservative leader Andrew Scheer was also sandbagging, had his rubber boots on, but was left alone for the most part. Joining me now to talk about all things political and a little bit of sandbagging is Brian Lilly, one of our regular contributors. Brian, Trudeau had kind of a rough week. First from sandbag dude, then referring to Japan as China. He was also mocked on The Simpsons.
Yeah, okay, let me start off with the sandbagging guy. And I always feel bad for politicians. It is kind of one of those damned if they do, damned if they don't moments when there's a natural disaster coming on. If they go, oh, you're taking resources away. If you don't go, oh, you don't care. And so I feel for politicians on these things. But I think what Justin Trudeau did was, and why he caught the ire of this particular volunteer, and then it was all caught on video, it went viral online, is that he brought along his kids. One of them is just about 5-6 years old, in that range. You know, you remember kids that age, Hal. They're not overly helpful on things like sandbagging. And Trudeau also took time to pose with a lot of people for a lot of pictures. And this volunteer was just infuriated that this was slowing up the process of trying to save people's homes in this rural West End part of Ottawa. So he let him have it, and it took off. The next day, he's standing twice, well, sitting once, standing the second time, with the Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, and twice refers to Japan as China. I mean, these are two countries that have had vicious wars. They still don't get along. Japan sees China as a national security and an economic threat. So that's bad. And then on Sunday night, to top it all off, he was mocked on The Simpsons. They had him doing the whole thing, the yoga move where he balances on his hands, kind of planks off the side of the desk. And Lisa Simpson asks him about the SNC-Lavalin scandal, and he scurries out the window and runs away. It didn't look good. And I asked him about this on Monday. He was making an announcement at an auto plant in Ontario. And said, look, is this deferred prosecution agreement with SNC-Lavalin still the right way to go? And he talked all about the jobs that it'll save, and he's going to stand up for jobs, anytime. And he referred to the entire scandal as an internal disagreement among Liberals. Of course, it's much more than that. It is potentially criminal, as I've explained before. This could be a violation of the criminal code. We'll have to wait and see what investigators have to say on that. But to just dismiss it as an internal squabble, an internal disagreement within the Liberals, that's a bit rich.
The SNC-Lavalin scandal is back in the news. I mean, not just with The Simpsons here. Illegal donor lists have been released, and the PM is commenting on that the government is keeping even more information on that file secret. Tell me more about that, Brian.
Yeah, I bet that Justin Trudeau wished this just came up in the episode of The Simpsons, but no, unfortunately for him, media reports looking into the illegal donor list. If you remember, there was about just shy of $120,000 that was donated illegally by SNC-Lavalin, and they signed a compliance agreement with Elections Canada. This is not up for dispute anymore. The company said, yes, we did this. What happened was from about 2004 to 2010, 11, in that range, what they were doing is they would tell their top executives, you or your spouse donate to these political parties and we'll reimburse you. Well, out of about 118,000, 8,000 or so went to the Conservative Party, and 110,000 went to the Liberals. So obviously they were very liberal friendly. And one of them was a spouse of one of the executives at SNC-Lavalin, was also at one point the Attorney General for the province of Quebec. And so these names are finally released. It was leaked to a media outlet. They published it, and Justin Trudeau's response is, "Oh, we wouldn't take those donations now." Well, I'm sure if you ask Stéphane Dion or Paul Martin or Michael Ignatieff, the other three Liberal leaders who were in charge when all of this went down, they would have, and you said, "Are you taking illegal donations?" They would have said, "Oh, no, we're not taking illegal donations." Look, I have trouble blaming the parties on this because I don't think the Liberals or the Conservatives necessarily knew. Maybe some of their operatives did. But, did the guys at Central Party headquarters know that this illegal scheme was going on? That's probably doubtful. But on the other side, you mentioned the fact that some information is being kept secret. SNC-Lavalin submitted a 55-page dossier, a 55-page report on why they should not be prosecuted. And they sent this to the Public Prosecution Service of Canada and said, here's why we should get a deferred prosecution agreement. Here's why you should do it. Well, some media outlets said, all right, access to information. We want to see this. The response from the government, this is commercially sensitive material. I'm sorry, they're facing criminal prosecution over bribery and corruption charges. I don't see how this falls under commercially sensitive material. This is public interest, but the government said they will not release it. And by the way, everything I took away from Justin Trudeau's answer to my question the other day, the government is still looking at giving SNC-Lavalin this sweetheart deal that would see them escape prosecution on those bribery and corruption charges and just walk away from it.
Wow, unbelievable. Brian, the UCP government was just sworn in here in Alberta. Jason Kenney says our Alberta government will repeal the carbon tax and join the other provinces in court to fight the tax grab. Our Prime Minister is not happy with all the Tory premiers ganging up on him, attacking him and his carbon tax, so Trudeau went in the offensive against your Premier, Doug Ford.
Yeah, so when I asked him the question about SNC-Lavalin and other things that we'll get to, it was at an auto plant announcement. Toyota has a plant in Cambridge, Ontario, about an hour west of Toronto, and they were announcing that they're bringing the Lexus SUV production there. So it's a bit weird to see this prime minister that's always on about carbon taxes and reducing carbon there to celebrate the arrival of an SUV production model, but there Justin Trudeau was, and he just went at the Ford government with one of the ministers. Christine Elliott, the health minister and deputy premier, is standing on stage with him, and he is going full hammer and tong at the Ford Conservatives and saying how wrong this is. He recently was at an international gathering in Montreal. And normally, you're on the international stage, you're in front of officials from other governments or the United Nations or business leaders. You don't have those internal country squabbles. The old line is, it's kind of like when you were a kid. If you and your brother and sister wanted to fight, you could fight all you wanted inside, but somebody else called your brother or sister names. No, that wasn't allowed. We show a united front as a family. Trudeau used this international gathering with Harrison Ford and a bunch of world leaders to bash Andrew Scheer and Doug Ford as climate change deniers. And he's going to be doing the same to Jason Kenney soon as the UCP and the Alberta government join this fight that now includes Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, New Brunswick, and possibly Prince Edward Island.
It's just incredible. The blue wave making its way across the country. Brian, more controversy surrounding our Prime Minister as he tried to link Andrew Scheer, Jason Kenney, and Doug Ford to white supremacy. And a recent story in The Sun, you say that it's really playing politics with terrorism, is what he's doing here.
Yeah, if you remember, we talked about this a week or two ago, the move to remove Sikh extremism and Khalistanis from the 2018 public report on the terrorist threat to Canada. And there was a lot of outcry in the Sikh community saying, oh, you can't blame all of us and you know, you can't link Sikh extremism. And well, actually you can. And there is a problem with that. Well, that same report also had Sunni extremism, Shia extremism, and right-wing extremism, which includes white nationalism. The right-wing extremism and white nationalism part was about a paragraph long. It's shorter than everything on Sunni and shorter than some other stuff, but Justin Trudeau has been using that as a club to beat every other conservative opponent that he's facing. And he's trying to link Doug Ford to right-wing extremism and white nationalism, Andrew Scheer and Jason Kenney. Jason Kenney, who when he was in Ottawa was known as Minister of Curry in a Hurry. Jason Kenney, who will go to every ethnic event that he's invited to and partake and know some of the language and know some of the customs. Doug Ford, who gets huge support from the Black community in Toronto, the Asian community in Toronto. You know, I've been out at events where this guy is just mobbed, especially by minority communities. But Justin Trudeau is trying to do this because he is desperate. He knows that their party is taking a hit over things like SNC-Lavalin, over other issues. And what's he got left? Well, let's call everyone a racist. Let's call everyone a white supremacist. And his liberal pundit, well, he doesn't call himself a liberal anymore, but Warren Kinsella used to run Jean Chrétien's war rooms. He ran the war rooms for Ontario Liberal Premier Dalton McGuinty. But he's disassociated himself with these guys. He says, when you call everyone a Nazi, then no one's a Nazi. And so calling Doug Ford, Jason Kenney, and Andrew Scheer Nazis just will not work. And in fact, it cheapens the actual hate crimes that are out there.
Another big issue that a lot of people in the prairies have with Justin Trudeau is the lack of pipelines being built. Now, new studies says the lack of pipelines is costing Canada more than $20 billion. Brian, what's the latest?
Yeah. And so we've heard before $13, $14, $15 billion a year that it costs the economy. And this latest study from the Fraser Institute says now it's closer to $20 billion. And of course, you know, the federal government did buy Trans Mountain Pipeline and the expansion. They overpaid, according to many estimates, but they bought it. They haven't built it. Now they're saying, okay, well, we're supposed to have a decision by the end of May. Oh, no, it'll be at the end of June. Possibly now, Amarjeet Sohi, the infrastructure minister, says we may not have a decision before the next election, which is in October. And so pipelines are becoming a huge problem. We have a bottleneck. And, you know, in Quebec, they say there's no social license for an Energy East pipeline that will run through that province. And they say they remember Lac-Mégantic. Well, if you remember Lac-Mégantic, then you remember that was a rail car situation.
Train, yeah.
And a train, and it was much more volatile, much more dangerous. Pipeline is, you know, across the prairies. How many times have you been stopped by rail cars, by trains going by filled with oil, trying to move across the country or down to the United States, Hal? You know, sure, it helps Warren Buffett, who bought into some of these companies that own the rail cars, that own the lines, but it doesn't help the industry at all. And so, yeah, up to $20 billion a year this is costing us. It's unbelievable. It's got to stop. It's got to be fixed.
You know, a big issue for Western Canadian farmers right now is China blocking Canadian canola, Brian. It's been devastating for farmers here, and you had a chance to chat with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau about it.
Yeah, so that was my follow-up question after asking him about his bad weekend and The Simpsons and, you know, being a punchline about SNC-Lavalin on a cartoon show. He kept talking about jobs, and he's there to protect jobs. And I said, well, wait a minute. There's literally thousands and thousands of jobs, far more than are at stake with SNC-Lavalin, that are at stake because of this canola crisis. It started with Richardson, but it's moved on to several other exporters as well. And we're talking about farmers across Alberta, across Saskatchewan, across Manitoba, and as I recently discovered, across Ontario, in particular, Northern Ontario, where there's a lot of canola grown as well. So this is a multi-province thing, and where's the help? The prime minister, so far has called a working group. They're going to have a working group. They've said that they'll send officials over. Look, we know that this is retaliatory measures by China. This is over the whole issue surrounding the Huawei CFO, Meng Wanzhou. We know that it's tied into the Canadians that are detained there, that are facing harsh treatment. This is all China trying to punish Canada. But our government has been weak on all of these fronts. They have not pushed back hard enough. They have not called in our allies. And some of our allies, because this particular government has frustrated them, aren't willing to stand up. And so our canola producers are looking at huge problems. This is on top of the problems that we've got with durum wheat producers trying to sell into Italy, where they've been selling some of the top quality wheat to go into pasta for years. The pulse crops going into places like India that are facing huge tariffs. There are many problems for agriculture, and I'm not sure that this prime minister gets it.
Now, according to a former top Canadian diplomat, Brian, China is building up lists of other Canadian businesses and exports that they can strike out at if the trade war escalates. Tell me more about that.
This is a former Canadian ambassador to China, Guy Saint-Jacques, who was doing an interview and was asked about it, and he said, regional governments have been asked, what contracts do you have with Canadian companies? What is being imported into your region that comes from Canada? They're building a list so that they can strike out. I mean, it's much the same way, although more sinister, it's much the same way that when it came to pushing back against the American tariffs on steel and aluminum, we said, okay, well, which politicians will we hurt? Which ones can we try and influence by putting tariffs or putting pressure on? And that's what the Chinese are doing, except it's on a much larger scale, and it's going to hurt our people much more than any tariffs, retaliatory tariffs that we put on the Americans.
Fundraising numbers are out, and the federal Conservatives more than doubled the Liberals' tally this past quarter. They're bringing in the big bucks.
Yeah, in the first quarter of 2019. So from January 1st until the end of March, this is vitally important. We're into an election year, Hal, and some people say that fundraising numbers are the equivalent of where's your vote going to go? Are you willing to put your money where your mouth is? The Conservatives raised more than $8 million. The Liberals, 3.8. So less than half of that. The NDP numbers at this point, as we're talking, the NDP numbers are not out, but the Conservatives raised more than double the governing party. Normally, the governing party, unless they're on their way to defeat, the governing party raises more money simply by the fact that they are the ones that hold the levers of power. Yes, we have done away with corporate and union donations, but as we discussed earlier, it doesn't even have to be as elaborate as SNC-Lavalin. You get a CEO, a president, they want to, be able to schmooze with the prime minister. Well, they're going to donate the maximum amount to that person. And well, maybe they want to do that to the opposition leader as well. And that is all legal and allowed, and they're able to do that. But people are not opening their wallets for the Liberals. And that is shocking, considering how popular Justin Trudeau is, or at least was, considering that this is a government that still does pretty well in the polls. Well, maybe that support is softer than we think. I tend to think that the Conservative support is softer than some of the polls. There was a poll out from Leger earlier this week that said the Conservatives have 40% voter support, the Liberals at 27%. I think that's a little bit of a stretch, but obviously these fundraising numbers show that when it comes to voting with your wallet, Canadians are willing to plop their money down with the Conservatives at a margin of more than 2-1 compared to the Liberals.
Well, here in Alberta, provincially, we say it was one and done when it came to Rachel Notley and the NDP. We'll see if it's the same thing for the federal Liberals and Justin Trudeau. One of our regular contributors, award-winning journalist Brian Lilly, joining me once again from Toronto. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Hal.
The world was shaken by the callous mass shooting at 2 New Zealand mosques that took 50 lives at the hands of a white supremacist. Now, is this particular brand of terrorism a major threat that is likely to repeat itself often in the future? Joining me now to discuss this further is Dr. John Robson. He's an invited professor at the University of Ottawa and a National Post columnist. And John and I also used to work together for the now defunct Sun News Network in Ottawa. John, how have you been?
I've been well, thank you. How about yourself?
Good, really well. Now, John, you recently wrote an interesting piece in the National Post entitled, "Sorry, Woke Brigade, White Nationalism Isn't a Major Threat." Now, in your article, you take issue with a tweet from Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland, which basically said that white supremacist terrorism needs to be at the top of the agenda in discussions about terrorism. Is Freeland wrong?
She's completely wrong. And it's important to realize that she said that at the United Nations. So she wasn't even talking about Canada, where I think proportionally white nationalism is probably a larger threat than it is globally. Around the world, something like 20,000 people a year are killed by terrorists. And very, very few of them are killed by white nationalists. In most countries, none at all. And what I thought was especially odd about this is that she seemed to be thinking only about Western countries and the things that happen here. That in a way, most of those people are invisible to her because the attacks happen in countries like Nigeria. And it seems so strange that our very globally minded, very woke foreign minister would just brush aside thousands of deaths. So, well, that doesn't interest us very much. And then, of course, we had the attack in Sri Lanka. And well, okay, is this not evidence that perhaps the real threat is Islamist terror, which in fact claims the majority of those lives? And most of the victims, I should emphasize, are not white. They're not Christian. They're mostly other Muslims. That's who's being killed by terrorists. And if we care about them, we should care about who's killing them.
So you're not saying that white supremacy is not a problem, but in comparison to the other types of terrorism that take place around the world, this one is nowhere near the top.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's not like it's a contest. It's not like it doesn't matter if white nationalists kill somebody, or as in the case of New Zealand, kill dozens of people. And that shooter, though his manifesto is a bit confused, he seems to have been a genuine white nationalist, that he targeted Muslims primarily because they weren't white. And he didn't like Muslims either. But, I mean, white nationalist, it's a complicated term. And as I point out in the piece, when you look at the major killings in the 20th century, and the biggest killers are Mao, Stalin, and Hitler. And Mao is ethnic Chinese killing other ethnic Chinese. Stalin is white. He's killing other white people. He primarily targets Ukrainians in his man-made famine for cultural reasons, because they are individual farmers and he's trying to impose collectivism. And Hitler's victims primarily were Jews, who, of course, it's ethnic and religious, but the Jews were as white as the Germans who were killing them. So you look around the world for the harm done by white nationalism or by white racism, of course, what you primarily see is racial slavery, a terrible evil over centuries. And I'm by no means minimizing that, or the fact that these white nationalists, squalid as they are, aspire to be dangerous, and they do sometimes manage it. But what I'm saying is the biggest killers are Islamists. And so if your idea is that we should stop every death we can due to terrorism, you look at who's killing the most people and you put them at the top of the list, and it's not white nationalists.
So do you think maybe Chrystia Freeland tweeted this about white supremacy and the terrorism just to simply score some political correct points with a liberal base?
Well, one is tempted to ascribe things to cynicism in politics, partly because Dumas once said that he preferred rogues to fools because rogues took vacations, and they know what they're doing. The trouble is with politicians, so often what you see is what you get, that you go, they can't be that shallow, and then you go, yeah, that really was all they had, that this is her woke, politically correct way of thinking about the world. And I wish that it was pretense and that secretly she was telling the Canadian security services, okay, watch out for ISIL, watch out for these guys, and also watch out for white nationalists and other, watch everything, but whoever guards everything guards nothing. So I wish I could just say, no, it's okay. It was just cynical. She knows what she's doing. But, I've watched politics for a lot of years, and when they say something utterly foolish about economics, it is what they think. When they say something utterly foolish about budgeting, it is what they think. When they say something utterly foolish about security, it is what they think.
John, let me ask you something. Why is it that a lot of the mainstream media and politicians want us to feel guilty about being middle-aged white men? Or just being white, period? What's going on right now? Why is there that trend?
The great strength of Western civilization has always been its capacity for self-criticism. And we shouldn't regard it as a bad thing. It's why the West has done so well over the years, because we always ask ourselves what we're doing wrong. But it can turn into something resembling self-hatred. I remember years ago, Vladimir Bukovsky is a Soviet dissident, and he said that American liberals are like the backward dog of Russian folklore. They wag their tail at strangers and they bark at their own family. And I think it just goes overboard, and we forget, when people talk about, oh, patriarchy, and isn't patriarchy awful? If you want real, terrible patriarchy, out of control, violent and murderous, look at the Islamists, because they are the male supremacists supreme on this planet. And instead you get Sonara Tobani saying, well, we'll never get rid of oppression of women until Western influence is eradicated. Good heavens, the West is the only place that ever tried to deal with the inequality of women. And I think these people just have hold of the wrong thing. They've lost their sense of perspective. And as a result, they fail to understand that the fact that we admit to our wrongs and we try to make amends for them. We look at slavery and say, how could the established institutions of Western society not have seen the evil of this form of racism? That's not because we're evil. It's because we're trying very hard to be good. We're asking, what did we get wrong? How can we get it better? And they should be happy about that. They shouldn't look at it and say, so you admit it. But too often, that's what they do.
Now, federal Conservative leader Andrew Scheer was accused recently of Islamophobia because he did not specifically say that the victims of the New Zealand shootings were Muslim. How should public figures really handle these kinds of things?
Well, I think they should not second guess themselves. They should speak the truth. And, it's interesting because there was both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton tweeted about the massacre in Sri Lanka and about Easter worshippers. Neither of them said the word Christian. Like, who worships Easter? Like, she was passé back when the Venerable Bede was writing. But nobody picks on them and says, hey, why don't you say the word Christian? But why didn't Andrew Scheer say they were Muslims? I mean, they're worshiping in a mosque. It doesn't take a lot of wit to figure out that they were Muslims, and indeed that they were targeted. As I say, I think first because they were non-white, but second because they were Muslim. It's quite clear that this was part of the murderous hatred directed at them. So just say, somebody murdered a bunch of Muslims. But at the same time, the liberal angle that Andrew Scheer is somehow, a secret Klansman minus the hood, that he's in bed with the white nationalists, that he probably is a white supremacist. Oh, come off it. Andrew Scheer is one of the nicest guys you could ever meet. He might have bad policies. He might be, kind of a milquetoast as a politician. But a white supremacist? And again, you'd think, please tell me it's cynical that they know he's not really. But the trouble is with politicians, so often what you see is what you get. That's really how they think.
The Calgary Stampede a couple of years ago, I had the chance to interview Andrew Scheer, and I got to tell you, he's one of the most humble, down-to-earth, approachable politicians you're ever going to meet. Now, you wrote about Nidal Hassan, who killed 13 people at Fort Hood in 2009, and what the Obama administration insisted was workplace violence. What effect does that have on the public if our leaders continue to frame things this way?
Well, to some extent it misleads them, but to some extent it drives them nuts, and they get alienated from mainstream politics. People look at Donald Trump and say, how could this man have won the election? And I didn't think he could either. But part of it, I think, is that a lot of ordinary people are fed up with this kind of walking on eggshells and refusing to tell the truth. Refusing to give the Purple Heart to the people wounded in that shooting because it wasn't related to their service in the military. I mean, that's just so mean and petty. And what do you think, we don't know that he was shouting Allahu Akbar? You think we don't know what it means? Or you think, well, we'll turn against Muslims and unless you pretend that this guy wasn't an Islamist? No, we're just going to think you're lying to us and you're idiots. So I don't know what they hope to accomplish, but it achieves the opposite. Again, as I said about Andrew Scheer, I say the same thing about Justin Trudeau and Barack Obama and everybody. Talk to us like adults. Admit it when something happens that doesn't quite fit your narrative of the world, and then explain to us why you're still right. Don't start evading and getting all slippery, because then we just stop trusting you.
So, John, you say you wish more of our leaders would be concerned more about anti-Christian violence internationally, countries like China, North Korea, Pakistan, what happened in Sri Lanka. Tell me more about that.
In many respects, although Muslims are most likely to be victims of terrorism in the world, Christians are the most persecuted religion. They're being driven out of the Middle East, including, the traditional homeland of Christianity. And there's kind of the feeling of, well, if we stand up for them, we're being bigoted, we're being patriarchal, we're being white nationalists, so don't mention it, as though it were okay because they're like us. Which maybe is one step above thinking it's okay if people are not like us are being persecuted, but it's not much of a step. The Chinese government is targeting them. If what is being done to Christians around the world were being done to Muslims, there'd be a huge outcry. If it were being done to Jews, I think there'd be more of an outcry, though anti-Semitism is a rising danger in our society. Too much of the left says they're anti-Zionist, and what they mean is they're anti-Semitic. There's just no getting around it. This weird, distorted news we get out of the Middle East, a fixation on Israeli atrocities, a great number of which are made up, and virtually no attention to the terrible things the Palestinians are doing to each other and, when they can, to Israelis as well. It's amazing the number of times people say, well, if only Israel was reasonable, there'd be peace in the Middle East. You look at what's on Palestinian TV, and in Israel's neighbors, the blood libel is mainstream. That's where the problem is. But for all the horrors of anti-Semitism, on a per capita basis, the worst persecution is against Christians. And we shouldn't call them Easter worshippers. We should call them Christians. We should insist that they have a right to live in peace. And as with anti-Semitism, we should regard anti-Christian violence as not just bad in itself, but as a worrying sign of the tenor of a society or a government.
You know, John, anti-Semitism is definitely on the rise. We've had those stories here on Bridge City News as well. What needs to change in the way Western governments and the United Nations respond to this?
Well, the United Nations, I've long thought, should be dismantled brick by brick and thrown into the East River. So phooey to the United Nations, you know. Anti-Semitism is sort of popular there, and you're not going to get that fixed because so many governments at the United Nations are nasty, illegitimate, and anti-Semitic. But Western governments, again, should not grovel. They shouldn't pretend we're not wrong when we're wrong. They shouldn't pretend that our history is pristine, but they should be proud of the fact that we and we alone, just about in the world, look back at our history and say, what did we do wrong? Instead of saying, we're the greatest, on often the most astoundingly spurious grounds. And they should say Christianity did not cause the world's problems. For instance, Christianity was instrumental in abolishing slavery. There was slavery under Christianity, and there was racial slavery. But the difference is that Christianity also had abolitionist movements, and those simply don't exist elsewhere in the world. And that's something we should be proud of. We should be proud of the fact that the push for rights for women is uniquely Western. We should be proud of the fact that individual freedom and the notion that the individual is made in the image of God and has inherent dignity are Western ideas. We should be proud of Magna Carta, and we should say we must always strive to live up to those ideals. We must confess and repent when we don't. But we shouldn't pretend that people who scorn those ideals are better than people who sometimes fall short of them. We should be proud of the Western tradition. That doesn't mean being white nationalists. Anybody who cherishes Magna Carta is welcome. It doesn't matter what you look like. It doesn't matter if your ancestors were on the other side of the world from Runnymede in 1215. That has nothing to do with it. But our tradition is a great treasure, and we should cherish it, and we should be proud of it.
Does the conversation also tie into some degree with our immigration and national security policies? Do we really need to change something in the way we screen or vet potential terrorists finding their way to live in Canada?
I think we certainly need to do that. And I think we ought to have an immigration policy that favors the kind of people who want to come to Canada because of what it's like. Somehow that, too, is regarded as bigoted, that we should want immigrants who want to make Canada like the place they came from or indeed fled from. And again, you know, immigration is a very top-of-mind issue. It's one of the reasons Donald Trump won. And if people are going around saying only fascists want to control immigration, the danger is that ordinary people are going to go, gosh, I must be a fascist. Who knew that? There's no reason why we shouldn't be selecting immigrants who want to be Canadian. But for that, again, we have to be proud to be Canadian. And again, yes, our national security policy on immigration needs to be aware that bad guys are trying to get into the country, and we shouldn't be shy about trying to keep them out. That's not bigoted. That's just being rational, including in the interest of all the law-abiding immigrants who come here, including if immigrants are coming here from a country with a powerful Islamist terrorist movement, the last thing they want is for those guys to come in next to them. They're coming here to get away from that stuff.
John, let me ask you something. You and I go out for a coffee, and I sit down with you and I ask you, John, how would you describe a Canadian? How would you define a Canadian?
Well, I would define a Canadian, you see, as someone who is born free. Remember, it was Wilfrid Laurier who said Canada was free and freedom is its nationality. Canadians always had small government. They cherished Magna Carta. They believed very much in free speech. They even, until fairly recently, they believed in the right to bear arms. This astounds people. But you look at what Sir John A. Macdonald said about the subject, and he said, gun control just disarms the law-abiding and leaves weapons in the hands of the rowdies. Canadians always had a small government because they were big. That's how this country ought to be. And the idea that Canadians have embraced big government, it's historically wrong and it's insulting that we can't do things for ourselves, including charity. So this might sound like I've mistaken this for some other country, particularly, say, the southern United States, but that's just because people don't understand our heritage. They don't understand who we are, why Canadians were so formidable in 2 world wars. It was to do, part of it was, yes, proficiency with arms, but mostly it was to do with a habit of self-government. Our privates, our corporals, our junior commissioned officers could take the initiative on the battlefield without discipline breaking down. This is a remarkable thing, and it's because we're part of the West. It's because we were founded on Magna Carta. And so to me, every immigrant who comes into this country, when they are made a citizen and they take the oath, I wish we would hand them a copy of Magna Carta and say, now it's yours. Congratulations.
There you have it. National Post columnist Dr. John Robson, thanks a lot for joining me today from Ottawa.
My pleasure.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and have a great night.